Welcome to Hey Listen, where we discuss faith, leadership, and the mission of the church. We're so glad you've joined us. Now to today's episode. All right, we are back with another podcast, and we've been apart for a few episodes. You had the opportunity to go serve in Spain on a mission trip.
I did.
And then I was not well. And so Colby so graciously stepped in my place.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. It was a lot of fun. And I'm glad you're doing better.
Yes.
And I had been trying to get to Spain. We have two partnerships there that we've had for a very long time, very different kinds of partnerships in different parts of Spain. Yeah. And I don't want to get into the details there because some of that's kind of sensitive places where we're at work. But it was amazing to see God working and using people who have direct connections with Ridgecrest and caring for some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And then also just seeing new churches being born in Europe. Yes, it was awesome. And I'm glad to be back as traveling. We were stuck in Atlanta and didn't get home until like the middle of the night. And then Jenny and I had to turn around and travel 5 hours by car for Thanksgiving. Yes. So I don't know that I want to do any more trips before Thanksgiving again, because that made it tough. And I have been so tired. Kayla, my mind has just been just about as discombobulated as I think it's ever been. But hopefully today we'll be cogent. Hopefully we'll be able to put it together.
Perfect. I'm sure it'll be great. So this sermon series has been a little bit different, or this podcast series, because it is based on a sermon. There we go. We got it out.
All right. We got it.
So we wanted to be able to just take time to go deeper into this text of Christmas, such a familiar story that we could all say, oh, we know the Christmas story, and move on. But you're preaching through it. And so now we have an opportunity to continue that conversation in the podcast.
Right. And the title of the sermon is Do You See What I See? And it is all about perspective. And it's about trying to look at familiar things with fresh eyes. And you and I both have been in church all of our lives pretty much. We've heard hundreds of Christmas sermons. We've sung hundreds, thousands of Christmas songs. And, I said to the congregation, I don't think it was in any of my notes, but we never grow tired of seeing the people we love. And so we should never grow tired of looking into the manger. And, as we do that, as we think about it, it needs to give us some, some fresh energy maybe as we go into the new year. Christmas is always, right at the very end of a year. This year's been a hard year, and yet, we're looking to the new year in 26 and looking forward to God doing great things. But for God to do great things, we need to be closer to Jesus. Yeah. And the Christmas story is that ultimate invitation to draw near to Him, and to look at Him again with fresh eyes and with fresh hopes. And Matthew's gospel is not in my view, I think Luke's telling of the story is maybe a little more robust, maybe a little bit more emotional and meaningful to people in general. But Matthew has some interesting angles, and he comes at it a little different. It's almost, I don't want to say mechanical, because it's not that. It's beautiful storytelling. Matthew is a beautiful storyteller. But his witness is a little different, and he focuses on some elements of the story and gives us a little bit more of a picture, especially of the wise men, which is what we want to talk about today. And we've already, if you were at church this past Sunday, you've already heard this sermon, but I want us to just go back and revisit these verses and this part of this story, because there's so much for us to think about when it comes to what does it mean to be wise? What does it mean to have knowledge? And what does power look like in the world? And then compare all of those things from a secular perspective to, how does that change with Jesus? How does it look different? And interestingly enough, Matthew helps us see that the wise men, the magi, give us a really good picture of what true wisdom looks like and what it really means to seek and to search for Jesus.
Okay. So that actually kind of answers the first question that you didn't know I had. But I had a question. What do you think Matthew most wants us to see about Jesus through the wise men narrative? And you kind of just answered that.
Yeah, maybe. To go a little deeper into that, Matthew's gospel is, if we were to ask someone, okay, what is the one verse in Matthew that most Christians can quote? What do you think it is? John 3:16. We know in John it's obviously John 3:16.
But probably the Great Commission.
But the Great Commission.
Sure.
The Great Commission is what we really think of when we think of Matthew. And what I'd like for us to do for just a moment here is to realize, so great writers will often drop hints early in a story or in a text, and then they'll bring it to completion at the end. I think the language that we use in literature is inclusio. So if you can imagine bookends on your shelf, if you have a shelf of books and you have a bookend on the left and a bookend on the right, I think the wise men, the Magi story is if we're on the one side, the beginning of Matthew, you have this unusual story of pagans. Okay, the Magi would have been like today, for instance. So when we go see a magic show with our children, we know it's sleight of hand and all that kind of thing. But in the ancient world, magicians would have had a pretty bad reputation amongst, especially the Jews and the religious people. They would have seen them as sort of like charlatans. And so the Magi, just that word would have been a little bit on the offensive side.
Interesting.
These are not, a lot of them would have been the kind of people that maybe were tricksters. Now, that's not fair necessarily. Like with most things, people generalize, right? But when we read the Magi, we're like, oh, these kings and all the three glorious kings and all that kind of thing. But I don't think that's necessarily how a first century Jew would have viewed Magi. They would have had some experience with them from the Babylonian captivity. Now that's 400 years before that, but the Hebrew people had a pretty good memory. They knew things. And they would have known that many of the Magi would have been known for kind of dark arts. Okay. So if you want to go back even further, if you want to, in the Bible anyway, and you go back to the Egyptian stories with Moses, right? And as he's dealing with these magicians, right? Okay, it's the same kind of thing. These individuals who seem to be tapping into, at least this is what they would claim, they're tapping into like the spiritual power. Now we know that some of them were just, again, like magicians today, they were just clever and they were trying to trick you with, fast movements of the hand and all those kinds of things. But I believe that the Magi of Babylon and then some of the magicians of Egypt probably were tapping into some dark powers. And so I think a first century Jew would have been looking at the Magi from that perspective, kind of looking at them as pagan sorcerers. More so than just rich men with high degrees of education, that's kind of what I think is going on here. So Matthew brings in these guys here in the first two chapters. Actually, chapter 2 is when they're introduced. And so I think if you take that, and remember what I said, the most well-known part of Matthew is Matthew 28, the last two verses, Matthew 28, 19, and 20. When you get to the Great Commission and you see that the gospel is supposed to go to the uttermost parts of the earth, and then you rewind the tape and you go back to Matthew 2 and you realize that the Magi had come from the Hebrew perspective, from kind of the end of the earth. So what you have there is an inclusio. Matthew is showing us all the way back in chapter 2 that he believes that Jesus has come for the world, not just the Hebrew people. And Matthew's often considered to be a gospel written to the Hebrews, as Colby and I were talking about it before. The original audience that Matthew might have envisioned would have been Pharisees and scribes. So those who are very familiar with the scriptures. Why do I say that? Well, when you look at Matthew's story of the Nativity, but then you go on beyond that, Matthew is constantly quoting Old Testament passages and connecting the Jesus movement with the Hebrew scriptures. So when we look at Matthew, his perspective is, I think, twofold. Matthew is a man of the Word, the Hebrew Bible. He is a man that now understands that God is for the world. He is for the Word and he is for the world. And so the Magi story, the three wise men, if that's how many there was 3 gifts or whatever, but the Magi story, I think, is a reminder that something new, something different has come, that Jesus has come to save the world. Now, the Hebrew people, they had texts, they had Bible verses, so to speak, that were telling them that their knowledge of who God was not just for themselves, but for the whole world. Psalm 67 and other great mission-minded Old Testament texts are there. Some of the prophets speak in that direction. But for the most part, by the first century, the average person in a synagogue would not have been thinking about that message being for the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. They would have been very much focused on the message for the Hebrew people. Mm-hmm. And for, if there was messianic conversation, it was messianic conversation in the sense of our king, we need a king. Mm-hmm. We need somebody to lead us from the oppression of the Romans. We need to be a nation again like we were under David and Solomon. And then Matthew comes and says, yeah, this king has come, mm-hmm. but he's not just for the Hebrews. Yeah, he comes first to his people, to the sheep of Israel. But Matthew wants us to see that the vision of God is much bigger than one nation. Yeah. It's for the whole world.
Yeah. So how do you think that theme, even Matthew being a man of the word and a man of the world, how does that help everyday believers approach Christmas now?
Yeah, I think that we need to realize that when we have this opportunity to celebrate Christmas, yeah, it's a Christian holiday, but in some of my travels in Europe, even just a few weeks ago, we were talking with some people who are ministering to Muslims. And these individuals were telling me how pleasantly surprised they were when they would begin to talk about a holiday that mm-hmm. was very much a Christian holiday, and they were trying to be sensitive to the Muslim perspective. Mm-hmm. You know, they were ministering in an area where a Muslim perspective was predominant. And the Muslim individual was like, hey, look, no, that's part of your heritage and story. I want to hear mm-hmm. about that. Mm-hmm. I want to understand what you believe about mm-hmm. Christmas. And this individual was telling me how refreshing that was, that to just remember that a holiday like Christmas is not just an opportunity for Christians to worship and to be focused on their own ideas of community, mm-hmm. but Christmas becomes this wonderful outreach opportunity. Yeah. I think, Kayla, that we understand that a little more when we come to Easter.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I think Easter has a more natural evangelistic sure. and outreach mm-hmm. stance. Mm-hmm. But I think Matthew helps set us up for the reality that Christmas has an equal power mm-hmm. in that regard, mm-hmm. that this is an opportunity for us to share our faith. And even as we talk about next week in our next episode, what we can see in Matthew's telling of the Christmas story is there's some heavy theology. Mm-hmm. There's some very important words that he uses and concepts that he uses to help us see that the Christmas story is about salvation.
Yeah, yeah.
It's about salvation.
Just a couple weeks ago, our fifth Sundays in kids ministry, we call them Game Changer Sundays. And mm-hmm. we present the gospel every single Sunday, but these Sundays are a little bit more directly focused. Every activity is really pointing to the gospel. And it's just funny, you know, I had just shared that with our kids. We have to have Jesus come as a baby to be able to right. have salvation and right. encourage them. We took time to pray, who can you be a light to at Christmas right. so that they can have the salvation that Easter brings, but how easily we think more of that for Easter than we do for Christmas.
Yeah. And Colby and I had talked about in ancient literature, when you have a story told of like a great leader, almost never do they say anything about their childhood or their birth, or unless the circumstances of their birth have something unusual. Sure. And occasionally you will see that in an ancient biography. But just the fact that 2 of the 4 Gospels do give us infancy narratives tells us something's different here. Sure. That we need to understand his origins, and I've shared, you know, Matthew 1:18 says the birth of Christ, but actually the word there is the same word we get Genesis from in Greek. It is the word Genesis. So what we have is the genesis, the foundation, the formation, however you want to look at that, of salvation itself. It's not just the birth of Jesus. This is the birth of the gospel. Yeah. And that's what Matthew, I think, is trying to tell us. And so, Christmas then becomes an opportunity for us to tell the world about the birth of the gospel. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to Herod a little bit. I have a note to ask. So you described him as powerful and accomplished and spiritually blind. What warning signs do you think modern believers should take from Herod's reaction? But I'd love to tell a funny Herod story really quickly.
Yeah, let me hear it.
When Aiden was, he's now 13, when he was about 3, we saw the Living Nativity at Silver Dollar City. And, Herod is sending out the wise men, and it's quiet in the room, and they're just reading scripture and acting it out. And as they do that, Aiden very loudly says, "He's lying," really loudly. It was hilarious. And so we watch that every year, and every year giggle when they get to the part. And I dare Aiden every year to yell, "He's lying," and he won't do it anymore.
No, I can't see him doing that anymore. But that is so cute, and it's so true.
Yes.
So he knew the story pretty well. So yeah, Herod. So as we're talking about. This sermon really is about the wise men, but I thought it was interesting, and I'm sure someone has thought of it before. It's not original with me necessarily, but I don't know that I had ever really thought about the Christmas story in Matthew anyway. It actually gives you the picture of more than one set of wise men, and Herod. One of the things that we tend to do in history is we get a perspective. So your son's perspective of Herod is he's a no good liar. And that's very true. But if you pull back and you look at Herod's story from a secular historical perspective, okay, so don't even include what the Bible says about Herod. And just look at Herod the man from history. There are very few figures in 1st century BC Palestine that even get close to the fame and power and renown of Herod the Great.
Interesting.
And anytime in history there is the great added, think about how rare that is. There's just a few in history.
Yeah.
In Russian history, Catherine the Great. Maybe I think Peter the Great too. And then in English history, there's only one king that gets the great, and it's it just went out of my head. 9th century, King Alfred the Great.
Okay.
Which, do you know much about him? Well, see,
I couldn't help you there.
There you go. But still, he's called the Great, and then Alexander the Great.
Sure.
So really, there aren't that many examples of that. And in history, when those few words are added, the Great, it means something.
Yeah.
So, again, as Christians, we say, well, this guy was like wanting to murder children, so how can you call him great?
Right.
Well, by the standards of the age, here's a guy who was known to be a great warrior, so he was a great general. He was very successful in the battlefield. Second thing, he was very, very shrewd as a leader. The Romans, in some of their histories, talk about his shrewdness, not in a good way. He was shrewd, and he would even murder his own children to stay in power. So he's that kind of guy. Okay. So the fact that he wants to murder Jesus shouldn't surprise us when he was murdering his own sons and his own wives and his own friends and counselors. He was a very bad guy. And the third thing, which is a little more positive, I guess, many of the ruins that you see today, if you go to Israel, you can see several examples of his art and architecture, more so architecture. But he was a great builder. He was the great builder of the 1st century BC. So if you think about it, if you're a Roman and you're trying to tell a history and you're talking about Palestine in the 1st century before Christ, Herod really stands out. He's a warrior, he's a politician, and he's a builder. Those are the three big things. Sure. If you think about it, in ancient history and in modern history, that's how people are immortalized, if they are good at one or two or three of those things. And really, Herod was in a sense great at all three. Okay. So if we want to just say, okay, who's the first wise man in the text that Matthew is giving us in chapters 1 and 2? Well, Herod would be the first one. Okay. But we also know that as he is interacting with the Magi come from way away, and they say, hey, we're looking for this one born king of the Jews. Well, Herod's ears are going to perk up there. He's a shrewd guy who's murdered his own family to make sure he stays in power. So when he hears that, you don't have to guess. And the original readers of Matthew's gospel would have known, that's the wrong thing to say to Herod. Okay. Now, here's another thing. Herod was probably near 70 years old.
Oh, okay.
So another thing we're not thinking about.
Sure.
So he came to power in 40 BC. 40 BC.
Okay.
So he has been in power for 4 decades at this point. This is at the very end of his life. So Herod is already a sick man at this point. In the ancient world, to live to be 70 years old, you're going to be having some problems.
Okay.
All right. So he was not a well man. He was facing mortality. He would have been familiar with the Bible a little bit. He would have been familiar with the idea of the concept of a Messiah. Here's a guy that's not too far from death. He hears from these magi that maybe a savior has come. And instead of thinking about turning his life around, even at 70, he's only thinking about preserving his power.
Yeah.
What a sad picture.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so getting back to the theme of salvation, how many people do you know, and I've known some, that in life have been successful, they've had good jobs, they've been able to do some things in life, but they get near the end and they're still not even thinking about that they're going to die, and they're not taking care of the business of the soul. So Herod is our first example, and he's really not a good example of wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. So let's, we're rapidly moving through our time. Let's talk just a little bit about the Magi. You painted a picture of the Magi experiencing great joy. Why do you think outsiders or pagans responded to Jesus with more hunger than God's own people?
Well, I think that we need to remember that knowledge of who God is something that's supernatural and spiritual. So the Spirit of God put a desire in their heart to know God more.
Yeah.
But before we talk too much about and I know we have about 7 minutes here, but let's talk just a little bit about the scholars, the Pharisees and scribes of Jerusalem. Now, keep in mind, Bethlehem is 6 miles away from Jerusalem. We're not talking about a long road trip here. We're talking about literally a morning's walk to get to Jesus. So if they got up the next morning, so the Magi come on, let's say they come on a Friday night. By Saturday at noon, they could have been in Bethlehem to see Jesus themselves. The Pharisees and Sadducees knew, and scribes, they knew the answer. So when the Magi came, the Bible Matthew tells us that Herod brought all the scholars together. And I'm sure they were kind of like, yeah, Herod, Micah 5:2. They were able to quote it. They would have known.
Right.
But there's no indication that they even took the trouble to walk 6 miles to see it for themselves. They knew the answer. So if Herod is an example of secular power and wisdom from a secular perspective, the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees represent religious knowledge without any real faith. They knew the answers. They could win in Bible trivia every time, but they had no relationship with God. Is that wisdom? Is it wisdom to know about God and not know God?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, that's not wisdom.
Right.
So if you look at it, Matthew is telling us Herod could be conceived or perceived as a wise person, but he's not. The Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees could be perceived as wise men, but they're not. The ones that are truly wise are the pagan magi. And we can just assume here that the Magi's resource materials would have been left behind in Babylon during the captivity, 400 years old. So the prophecies and the impetus for looking for the star and all of that must have been from about the time of Daniel. So these were scholars, and scholars work in old documents. They would have been familiar with them. But what's interesting is they took these old documents, they saw the prophecies, the star appears, they're able to connect the dots, and they go to great lengths. They travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles to find this new king. Now, again, Herod and the Pharisees and scribes have 6 miles. They won't go that far.
Yeah.
But the Magi traveled hundreds, if not thousands of miles. And so this is where it really touches down, I think, for us to think about today. How many people in Springfield have been raised around Christmas traditions and Christian traditions? And even though many of them, I mean, we'll have a big crowd on Sunday, and so will every other church in Springfield. But how many thousands will be within a few steps of a church and not bother to go to worship?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this whole idea of when we're talking about a lack of wisdom, on Herod's part or the Pharisees or the scribes. Hey, we can leave it in the past or we can bring it to the present. We live in a country where many people would say, oh, this is a Christian nation. And I want to say, prove it. Prove it. Prove it to me. Because no, we would say the Magi were pagans and yet they were looking for Jesus. But we look and we see the Pharisees and we say they wouldn't even go see him. How is it any different if you know people who say that they're Christians? If you ask them, if you've witnessed to them, they say, oh yeah, we're believers, and they can maybe even tell you what church they're a member of. But if their faith can't even get them to church on Christmas, then I would say they're probably more in the Herod camp or the Pharisees and scribes camp. And that ought to scare us. That ought to scare us. But the Magi are the beautiful, brilliant, bright light shining in this story. And again, it is a reminder that God is at work all around the world. And he brings these Magi into this moment to see the salvation that has come to the world.
Yeah. There's this song, it's on the shepherd side, not the wise men, but a children's music group that does a lot of scripture, a song called Slugs and Bugs, which is the silliest name ever. But they have this
Profound.
song. It is. They have this song called A Shepherd Dad. And it talks about the shepherd going, and then his son wants to go with him, and he said, no, you stay here. And he gets there. It like makes me emotional think about it every time, but he gets there and he sees baby Jesus and he runs. He talks about it. The song talks about him running back and throwing his son up on his shoulders and running to see Jesus. And just what a beautiful picture that is. As parents, we need to run our kids to the manger, to see Jesus too, to experience that during the holiday season and all around. But we have the opportunity to bring people to Jesus. We have to act on it.
So let me tell you what's interesting is Luke takes that perspective that and the emotions you're feeling right now. Think about it. Luke tells us about the shepherds. Matthew does not. Luke tells us the stories about the more intimate stories about a mom and her baby. Matthew does not. So we really do have a more female, emotional, and I mean that in a good way, but a more sacred, precious kind of thing going on in Luke that we have in Matthew. Matthew's a little bit more business. He tells us more about the Magi. Now, I want us to go from Slugs and Bugs to Leonardo da Vinci.
Perfect. What a transition.
A perfect transition. So we're going to throw a picture up here to look at. So we have a minute left. And the sermon, we ended with this, but I wanted to just take a moment and look at it. Da Vinci was probably the greatest artist of at least the last 1,000 years. And this is an altarpiece that he did, and I think he did it when he was younger. But I just want people to look at it. And on the left side of the screen, in the frame, you see Jesus and Mary. You see them there, and then you see the Magi approaching them. So you kind of see this precious moment. But what we need to look at is Leonardo da Vinci, I don't believe, was a believer, but he understood the Bible well. And if you look around it, there's warriors, there's broken down buildings, there's all this chaos around. You see, what the Bible tells us is that Jesus came into a chaotic world to bring hope and salvation and peace. That's the Christmas message. And Da Vinci gets this right. There is hope in Jesus, and the true wisdom, the true wise people in the world are going to come and bow before him and worship. That's what Da Vinci is saying, that the chaos is around us for sure. But Jesus was willing to enter into the chaos to bring us hope and peace. And Matthew's story of the Magi ends with worship and with joy. And that's why Christmas, as believers, we should be filled with happiness, with worship and joy.
Thank you again for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Hey Listen.